Okay, thank you for inviting me to talk about traffic light labelling in the UK. In my presentation, I'm going to start by talking about what we actually mean by front-to-back labelling. Secondly, to think and talk about traffic light labelling in general, then traffic light labelling in the UK, and then to describe some strengths and weaknesses of the UK traffic light labelling scheme and make some suggestions about how it might be improved. So I think traffic light labelling front-to-back labelling can be classified into 6 types. Firstly, there's a supplementary interpretive labelling, interpretive nutrition labelling, which divides into nutrition-specific systems and summary indicator systems. In the first type of nutrient-specific systems, we have things like traffic light labelling, and with summary indicator systems, we have schemes like the Health Star rating system and the Nutri-Score system in France. And these, in my view, are the true types of front-to-back nutrition labelling. Then we have 4 types of front-to-back labelling, which can be called health and nutrition claims or health warnings. So at the top, you have health and nutrition claims, which are simple, and they can be just for nutrients and they keep the nutrients separate, or they can summarize the overall nutritional quality of the food and give you an overall indication of the healthiness of its healthiness. In that category, we have things like the Keyhole Choices International logo and TICS logos from heart foundations. And the last 2 types of front-to-back labelling are the warnings, health and nutrition warnings. And we just heard about the Chilean health warning system. That's a nutrient-specific system which keeps the nutrients separate, but you could, in theory, have an overall warning for the healthiness of the food. You could, in fact, have a red keyhole to complement the green keyhole. But these 4 types of front-to-back labelling on this slide, I think, are not true types of nutritional labelling. I think it's very important to bear in mind 2 aspects to simplified front-to-back labelling in general and traffic light labelling or any other form of labelling. And that's the design and the format. Firstly, the design and the format of the label, and secondly, the underlying nutritional criteria, the nutrient profiling model. They should not be muddled together, and they're very different. So let's turn now to traffic light labelling systems around the world. I think it hasn't spread very far beyond the UK. In the UK, it began or was introduced in 2006 by the then UK Food Standards Agency and retailers following suit. And then we have the Ecuadorian traffic light labelling, the Iranian traffic light labelling, and a new industry devised traffic light labelling scheme called the Evolved Nutrition Labelling System. And these 4 types of traffic light labelling actually involve different nutrients and different reference amounts for the underlying nutrient profiling model. So when designing or devising a new form of front-to-back labelling, I think you have to address a series of questions. Firstly, about the nutrient profiling model, and secondly, about the design. And this is what we did in the UK when devising the UK traffic light labelling system, and it took several years to come up with a good system. So firstly, I think you need to decide whether you're going to put the labelling on all foods or just some categories of foods, whether the thresholds need to be the same or different for different categories. Generally, people have different thresholds for foods and drinks. You need to think about which nutrients you're going to involve, what the reference amounts for those thresholds should be, whether they should be per 100 grams or per serving. And finally, you need to really decide how strict you want the thresholds need to be. So in the case of traffic light labelling, how many reds there are going to be on foods relative to greens. And secondly, turning to design, there are various aspects to the design of the traffic light labelling which need to be considered, particularly whether to supplement the colours with things like words like high, medium or low, or numbers. So here's the UK traffic light labelling scheme. Firstly, the underlying nutrient profiling model. All foods are judged on the same basis and all drinks are considered separately. The green amber thresholds are set at the levels for low in European legislation on claims, and the amber red thresholds are set at 25% of the reference intakes per 100 grams and per serving. You could say a lot about the nutrient profiling criteria and how we arrived at the precise numbers. And then secondly, here's the design of that UK traffic light labelling scheme, this design is limited to some degree by the 2011 European legislation on food information. So for example, we have to have in our labelling scheme fat rather than saturates, sugars and salt and energy as well. We couldn't have any other nutrients such as fibre or whatever. The guidelines in the UK for this format were drawn up by industry, but in collaboration with the government. There has been a lot of research carried out into traffic light labelling in the UK and elsewhere, both in the design and in the underlying nutrient profile model. There have, in the course of developing the model, been lots of studies, again carried out by the UK Food Standards Agency into the preferences of consumers. Consumers generally like traffic light labelling compared with other forms of labelling available at the time at least. And there have been some performative studies, i.e. testing exactly whether traffic light labelling helps consumers make choices between healthy and unhealthy foods. But those studies were generally done in labs or online. There have, again, also been some research carried out once the scheme was developed, and particularly some research by my group into looking at how the introduction of the traffic light labelling affected consumers' food purchases. And I should say, in general, the results have been disappointing, that it's been difficult to demonstrate an effect of the introduction of traffic light labelling in the UK on consumer purchases. And it's also said, of course, the labelling scheme has had an impact upon producer behaviour in getting them to reformulate their products to avoid reds. But again, most of that evidence is anecdotal. There has also been a little bit of research into the nutrient profiling model itself. So a scheme, for example, can be quite effective in getting people to change their behaviour, but unless the underlying nutrient criteria are good for health, if you like, it's not going to be useful in the end of the day for health. So some strengths, some weaknesses, pluses and minuses of the UK traffic light labelling scheme. I think it's better than a lot of than nutrient-specific schemes that are not colour-coded, such as the industry-developed percent GDA scheme, but it's not as good, in my view, as colour-coded summary indicator systems, such as the Nutri-Score, which we're going to hear about later. Consumers can choose the nutrient they want to focus on because the nutrients are kept separate, but that means the scheme doesn't really give you an overall indication of the healthiness of the foods. It's quite simple, but I also think it's too simple, that it doesn't include within it levels of beneficial nutrients. It's just a warning system, if you like, against high levels of unhealthy nutrients. So how would I improve it? I think there's lots of ways the UK traffic light labelling scheme could be improved. One would be to add an extra category for fats and oils with different thresholds, to make it a 3-category scheme, such as the FSAN's, Food Standards Agency, Australia, New Zealand, nutrient profiling scoring criteria. I would lose the light for total fat. I think there's increasing evidence that it's the balance of types of fat in the diet that matters, not the overall fat intake. I would swap the light for total sugars for one of free sugars. We cannot do that at the moment because constrained by EU legislation, but come Brexit, we'll be able to do that. We can set all the thresholds on a per 100 gram basis than a per serving basis, and I think we could go into that in the discussion. And I would drop the reference intake per serving information and also make the red amber threshold stricter. So these are my ways of improving the model. Just to summarize about those 6 types of front-of-pack labelling systems I showed you earlier, I think this slide tries to argue the point that just having a good impact on consumer purchasing behaviour doesn't necessarily mean it has a good impact on health, and we need to separate those two. So, for example, I think the warnings systems that has just been described from Chile, undoubtedly, from other pieces of research, not just carried out in Chile, has an important impact on consumer purchasing behavior. But because it doesn't give you an overall indication of the healthiness of healthy foods, for example, I think its impact on health is limited. And this slide shows that I think the best available system at the moment is something like a summary indicator system, as implemented in France, the Nutri-Score system, which has both quite a good impact on consumer purchasing behavior, but a better impact on health than some of the schemes. So that I'd like to stop. Thank you very much.